My name is Stephen Reily. I'm the founding director of Remuseum. Remuseum is a think tank focused on financial sustainability, relevance, and governance for American art museums. It's housed at Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art in Bentonville, Arkansas, and I work very closely in partnership with another Bentonville partner, Art Bridges Foundation. I'm really excited to be here today. And I also want to share that Remuseum is going to be issuing our second research report tomorrow called Access, Scale, and Market Share, with some interesting sharing data from the first non-proprietary database on over 150 major American art museums, with some interesting insights and questions to ask at this important time around access, especially in scale for museums. But now for today's show. Why are we presenting a webinar on untapped sources of revenue? Well, revenue has always been a not fully met need for American art museums. When I became a museum director, I learned that the history of American museums, over the history of American museums, the ambitions and costs of museums have often exceeded the revenues of museums. And so museums are always looking to diversify their sources of revenue, very importantly. The last few years have become increasingly challenging for museums financially in new ways. First of all, for the average American art museum, data suggests that visitation remains below pre-COVID levels. Expenses are way up, in part driven by the desire and the demand to compensate museum workers more equitably. And the massive wave of COVID relief funds that were provided by the federal government from 2020 on have mostly been spent. So there are new gaps for museums to fill. And of course, now it's 2025, and museums are facing a new set of challenges and uncertainties ahead, especially financially, with the narrowing definition of grants available from the NEA and the president's stated desire this week to terminate the IMLS, a major source of grant making for museums. It's more important than ever for museums to find and identify every source of revenue available to support their critical museums at a time when we need them more than ever. So that's the premise of it. I'm really excited to have the three speakers who are going to represent very different aspects of funds that are available to American museums today, some relating to the environment, some relating to donor-advised funds, and some relating to impact investing. Just before I start my introductions, I do want to just talk a little about the logistics of this. Thank you for signing in through the chat, because the chat's available for any purpose. If you do have questions, please try to focus them on the Q&A prompt at the bottom of your screen. We'll also be looking at chat for them. If there are really relevant questions, points of correction or clarification, I'll interrupt our speakers, and otherwise we'll save them for the last 20 minutes of the program. And then by follow-up. First of all, this webinar is open to everyone, and the content is going to remain free and freely available to everyone in the museum sector and beyond. So in a week or so, we will share a video of this presentation together with a PDF of the presentation shared by the three speakers. We'll also post that video on Remuseum's YouTube page, and also share contact information if any of you want to follow up with these three very experienced leaders in the field. So now, time for introductions. The first of our speakers is going to be Stephanie Shapiro, the co-founder and managing director of Environment and Cultural Partners, a US-based nonprofit organization dedicated to accelerating environmental leadership within the cultural sector. Stephanie oversees ECP's operations and portfolio, including the Frankenthaler Climate Initiative and Climate Resilient Resource for Cultural Heritage. Before co-founding ECP, Stephanie worked as a management consultant at Eagle Hill Consulting, as well as in the Smithsonian Institution's Office of Advancement, where she led significant projects in museum operations and fundraising. Stephanie earned an MA in Museum Studies from the George Washington University and a BA in Art History from Dickinson College. She's written, spoken, and published extensively on advancing climate action and sustainability practices within the museum community. She also led the American Alliance of Museums, the AAM's Environment and Climate Professional Network, for 3 years, and represented U.S. cultural institutions at UN climate change conferences in 2019, COP25, and 2022, COP27. Our second speaker is Anna Raginskaya, a partner of the Blue Rider Group at Morgan Stanley, a boutique advisory practice providing financial services to clients in the cultural community. Anna focuses on her team's engagement with the art and impact investing communities and strategic planning for nonprofit clients. As an Investing with Impact director, Anna works closely with Morgan Stanley's Institute for Sustainable Investing, helping clients use their investments to advance change in environmental and social justice. She writes and speaks frequently on the topic of value-aligned investing for arts organization and has moderated panels at Confluence Philanthropy, Grantmakers in the Arts, and the AAM Annual Conference. Anna earned her BA in the History of Art and Architecture from Harvard College and an MBA from Harvard Business School. She serves on the board of the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council and professional advisors to the international art market, and is on the advisory board of Pro Cinema and the Arts Funders Forum. Anna was born in Ukraine and is fluent in Russian. And finally, our third speaker is David Sand, the co-chief impact strategist at Community Capital Management, which has invested over $17 billion in impact initiatives and manages over $6 billion in impact assets. A trailblazer in impact investing for over 40 years, David co-founded Access Capital Strategies in 1994 and served as its president and chief investment officer until 2010. There, he pioneered the development of market rate, fixed income impact investments tailored for institutional investors. David then worked as a consultant to community development financial institutions, CDFIs, nonprofits, and social enterprises. He serves on the boards of the Adirondack Foundation and the New York Advisory Board for Enterprise Community Partners and ARIS, the Information Service for Community Investors. While earning his AB in American History from Princeton University, David worked summers at the American Museum of Natural History, supporting efforts for the museum to be more closely connected to its surrounding community, and later earned an MPA from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Museums have tended to rely on a relatively narrow range of sources of contributed revenue from philanthropy and sometimes from municipal bonds. So our effort is to open up a host of other options that museums might consider in funding their capital and operating needs. So with that, I'm delighted to kick it off with Stephanie Shapiro. Thank you, Stephanie.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephen and Remuseum, for having me. Welcome, everyone. We know this funding is a very hot topic for us, so I'm going to begin speaking about a few private foundation opportunities and then move into talk about some federal funding. So to begin with, I'm going to talk about the Frankenthaler Climate Initiative, and it looks like from the chat we have some past recipients on it. So the Frankenthaler Climate Initiative is by the Helen Frankenthaler Foundation out of New York, and this is in collaboration with my organization, Environment and Culture Partners, as well as RMI. And it's the most prominent private funding model that launched in 2021 to support visual arts institutions and undertaking clean energy and energy efficiency projects. So this makes it the first private nationwide program in the US dedicated to combating climate change within the visual arts sector. So this program addresses the need for infrastructure funding in visual arts organizations, focuses on essential but often overlooked upgrades like solar panels, what's in your systems and what's in the basement, what's on the roof, your HVAC systems, energy audits, building automation. So the goal is to inspire public awareness and encourage climate smart decisions. And since its inception, the initiative has awarded over $14 million in grants to more than 200 visual arts organizations and has a total commitment of $15 million. So in good news for folks that are on this call that are visual arts organizations, the 2025 grant cycle is still open. To be eligible and look at the guidelines, please visit our website, frankenthalerclimateinitiative.org. Applications are due March 28th, and we're accepting applications for 3 grant categories: Catalyst, Technical Assistance, and Scoping. And for organizations in LA County, the deadline for these applications is April 7th. So I definitely suggest everyone go to the website. If you are a visual arts organization, you must be based in the United States and its territories. That is one of the eligibility requirements. You can also learn more about additional eligibility on the website. Next slide. So similarly, another New York foundation, the Tiger Foundation, they've created a Climate Action for Curators grant program. So this helps contemporary art curators reduce their environmental impact and enhance climate awareness while executing their already received Tiger Foundation funded projects. So this project began as a pilot in 2023, and since then has become a full program. And so like the Helen Frankenthaler Foundation, this program supports a mission-aligned audience, curators in the climate realm in this case. So I know that the Tiger Foundation recently updated its grant cycle. So I suggest that you go to their website, tigerfoundation.org, for more information. But this is, again, another leading organization providing arts funding for the sector. Next slide. So one thing I do want to address before we move into federal is one additional opportunity that I just learned about, but it's the Anonymous Was a Woman Environmental Art Grant. Their grant cycle is also open through April, and this is administered by the New York Foundation for the Arts. And this provides up to $20,000 for environmental art projects led by women identifying artists in the United States and the U.S. territories. So that website is anonymouswasawoman.org, and you can go there for additional information. So with interest in action and climate activities increasing and the need absolutely just vital right now, one thing that our organization and others and those on the call are really working on are building strong bridges to benefit the arts and culture sector. And that's focusing on cooperative funding and collaboration. So we're looking to create these models within the sector and, without. So not just arts foundations, but looking, into other organizations and foundations and private funders that are interested in filling this gap that is widening with the decrease in potential federal funding. So we are hoping, this year and, as soon as we're able to be providing updates on additional funders, additional programs that are, coming to fruition in response to the needs that organizations, arts and culture organizations need. So before I move into federal funding, I want to say this is a moving target. And that I do not have all of the answers. So I am going to talk about a few different topics and then also share some very valid informational resources for you to use to ask questions, to explore, and that will help you probably answer any questions and attend to any existing federal funding or future federal funding that you're looking for. So first, I'm going to start with the directive, or also called elective pay tax credits. So these have been in the news a lot. These that are listed on the screen are those that are generally have been the ones that have been most relevant and accessible to arts and culture nonprofits in the United States. So these are only eligible for organizations that own their property to claim a tax credit. And these are, if you've been reading in the news, the clean energy tax credits. So while there is interest, since these are part of the Inflation Reduction Act, IRA, to repeal some of these tax credits, what we're thinking is that some of these tax credits will not be cut. And that's because there's bipartisan support for some of these tax credits, including these 80% of investments are in Republican-led states. And additionally, if you look kind of in what the impact would be repealing some of these tax credits, research report from the Brattle Group and the National Economic Research Associates, estimate that the average electricity rate would increase by 7% by 2030. So that's if the tax credits would be repealed. So for any of these to be changed, legislation needs to be passed in Congress, which is, again, very possible. But we are thinking that also some of these changes will be made maybe at the utility level in terms of relevance, and potentially not at the organization and entity level like nonprofit arts and culture organizations. So one note that I want to make about the first two, the investment tax credit number 48 and the production tax credit number 45, are that starting January 1st, if you were researching these last year, those have now moved into what's being called technology neutral tax credits. These are sections 45Y and 48E. So this is for clean energy generation and storage, replacing and so these replace those tax credits. These are emissions-based incentives that are neutral and flexible between clean energy, clean electricity technologies, which is great because it means that they're not just for only specific technologies like X amount are only for solar or only for geothermal. These are looking at a wide range of clean energy sources. So this is available to taxpayers with a qualified facility and energy storage technology that are being used as of January 1st of this year. Next slide. So you can learn more about that, all of those tax credits and additional resources from a great organization called lawyersforgoodgovernment.org. So L4GG has put together some of the most easy to use, comprehensive, and frankly, easy to understand resources on IRA, elective pay, tax refunds, what's going on in the federal government, what would be, what could you get help with in terms of technical assistance, et cetera. So please go to this website, look at their resources, ask them questions. They also have opportunities for pro bono technical assistance, which I'll talk about shortly. But this is really a fantastic resource with a data-driven and inside sources on what could be and how you can protect your organization from that has existing federal funds and opportunities for future federal funds. So they also have a technical assistance and resources to secure new funding and safeguard existing awards guide. So this is to help communities navigate the regular updates that are, we're hearing to federal funding availability and requirements. So this was created in collaboration with a number of other organizations, including the Environmental Protection Network, the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, the Electrification Coalition, and a few others. And so after this call, we will be sending to everyone the resources that we are talking about in here. So we'll make sure that that link is provided. The greatest piece about this resources is how it's organized, existing funding, new funding. It's by agency, federal agency, and it provides lots of resources for free, technical assistance support as needed. Lawyers for Good Government has also worked very closely with Treasury and the IRS on creating a lot of their resources and tools. And so there's been an open line of communication between these groups, which we also, have been able to then have, very valid information coming in for and reflected in these resources. Next slide. So one other resource from them is this Clean Energy Tax Navigator. Again, this is a really simple way to assess your eligibility, learn about after you kind of research and learn about what's out there, what in the steps you would need to even qualify and steps you would need to even, get this direct pay, this funding straight from the IRS. So we definitely suggest that you look at this. This is being updated in time, as we learn more information. Next slide. So one other resource that I want to share is sponsored by Bloomberg Philanthropies, and it's the American Cities Climate Challenge. So this was formed with an investment of $70 million to enhance the work already being done by mayors across the US to support cities doing climate work. So this is a federal funding search tool. Again, this is updated in time, and you can filter by applicant type. What is shown here is that you can filter by cultural institutions. And so this is where you can learn, hear about that new clean energy investment tax credit I was just talking about. Next slide. So finally, these are all of the resources that I've just gone over, in addition to two others. America's All In is a coalition of over 5,000 US cities, states, tribal nations, businesses, schools, faith, health, and culture organizations working together to address the climate crisis on a civil society basis. So ECP represents the cultural sector on the Partners Committee, and they have tons of free resources, including a federal climate funding hub. They have great, talking points for advocacy, as well as lots of connections that you could make to your mayor if you don't, know who they are, to local businesses, etc. So we definitely suggest that you get connected with them for those regular updates as well. In addition, at the bottom of the screen, we have the overview of the IRA. This is a webinar that we did last year with the FIPS U Climate Toolkit. RMI, and the Mountaineers. And this just gives you a bit of an overview on what parts of the IRA are eligible for arts and culture organizations. Next slide. So before I close, I just want to add that I know there are programs in question. We've been getting a lot of questions about the National Endowment for Humanities, their climate smart grants. We haven't heard, anything official on if they will continue or not, in terms of the new NOFO that is out right now. In addition, as Stephen, talked about, the Institute for Museum and Library Services is currently a target for the administration to dissolve. And so I would suggest that you visit the American Alliance for Museums and the American Library Association. They have fantastic scripts, resources, and advocacy tools to use for you and your communities, and to use to talk to your representatives in Congress, knowing that these, IMLS, constitutes such a tiny part of the federal government's overall budget. These are, in the past, when in the first term of Trump, we know that IMLS was also, attempted to be dissolved. And because libraries have, and museums have been historically a bipartisan issue, it did not go through. We're hoping with even more, more support, this does not go through again. I know on the first day, AAM reported that over 11,000 calls were made, I think just on Monday. So we definitely encourage everyone to get on the phones, outreach, and, engage to make sure we keep this funding, available for our organizations. So before I pass it over to Anna, we'll be in contact and communication with Stephen, and on our website, you'll be able to follow along as we, are able to hopefully stand up additional funding opportunities and share additional opportunities that we hear about for organizations to be able to do this important work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. What a great, abundant source of resources at a time where they're needed, and information is needed as much as the resources. You all have, as we roll over into Anna Roginskaya's presentation, if you haven't heard of DAFs, they're one of the hottest topics in philanthropy because there is an enormous amount of capital tied up in them. I'm going to let Anna describe them, as well as a really novel use that she and Blue Rider Group have come up with to consider the use of art in relation to donor-advised funds. So Anna, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm a big fan of what Remuseum is doing. In the context of our broader work in values-aligned investing, we actually collaborate very frequently with community capital management. So I'm mostly honored to be David Sand's warm-up act. I think it's a real treat that you'll be hearing from him in a moment. So what I'm focusing on today is actually like one interesting strategy that we've seen clients use, either donors to amplify their capacity for charitable giving, or nonprofits to broaden and expand potential sources of revenue. And it's something I'm particularly excited to be talking about in this uncertain moment for nonprofits and their funders, and museums in particular. So let's dive right into it. We're going to be talking about donor-advised funds, DAFs for short, and how they can be an interesting tool for nonprofits to facilitate gifts specifically of tangible assets. So I'm talking about artwork, jewelry, wine, and other passion assets, and convert them into much-needed cash gifts for the institution with pretty limited hassle for the museums or nonprofits themselves. So I'll begin with a very quick overview just to catch everyone up to speed on what a DAF actually is. They've been around since the 1930s, but became very popular in the 70s. And a DAF is basically a 501c3 nonprofit that houses charitable giving accounts for multiple individuals and families. Donors contribute assets to the DAF. That could be cash or appreciated stock, typically, or in this case, we're talking about other tangible assets, and they get a tax deduction in exchange. The DAF then sells the contributed property and funds a charitable giving account in the donor's name. And once that account is funded, the donor can then, at their will, instruct the DAF to make distributions to qualified nonprofits. The donor can also choose to invest a portion of the assets in the DAF and grow their capacity for charitable giving over time. So Stephen alluded to this. There is really a tremendous amount of money currently held in DAFs, approximately $250 billion. So this is a pretty significant source of potential capital for the nonprofit sector. An important kind of distinction between a DAF and a private foundation is private foundations are mandated to spend 5% of their assets by law every year. DAFs are not. However, according to the 2024 national study on DAFs, the average DAF was actually paying out about 18% a year. So it's sort of a misconception that money is just sitting in these DAFs and not going out. In fact, DAF holders on the whole tend to be quite charitable. So a lot of this might be old news. Again, the kind of novel thing that we're discussing here today is the ability to leverage the DAF to accept complex assets. So that could be real estate, artwork, jewelry, wine, classic cars, rare books, other collectibles, many things that the kinds of people that are donating to your institutions might also own and maybe thinking about what to do with in the future. So let's go to the next slide. So let's take a step back and just consider the example of a museum that has a longtime donor that's already contributed a significant amount of cash to the institution. They might be giving annually, maybe they supported the recent capital campaign. And like many wealthy donors in this organization's orbit, they also have a large art collection that's appreciated significantly in value in the decades that they've been collecting. The donors' children, surprise, are not interested in the art, and the donor is starting to think about a plan for that collection. So many donors, their first thought is, I'm going to give this artwork to a museum. But as many of the folks on this call know, it's become increasingly difficult to matchmake and find an institution that's actually willing to accept the object and like commit to its care. For the donor, however, finding a museum that will take the artwork is sort of their best case scenario from a tax perspective, and we will be talking about taxes shortly. But let's say the primary intent for this donor is actually to support the museum financially. They care about their work, and they don't particularly have an attachment to the idea that this artwork will hang on their wall, hang on the museum's wall in perpetuity. So this is where a DAF becomes a really compelling structure, because one of the biggest hurdles for museums to accept gifts of property like this and ultimately turn them into cash is they have to be responsible for the care and the deaccessioning of that object once it comes in. First of all, many gift policies might simply not allow for these kinds of gifts, or second of all, the staff just might not be prepared to handle dealing with that kind of property. And in fact, just earlier this week, I was talking to someone who told me that a previous institution they had worked at was offered a townhouse as a gift by a longtime donor, and they had to decline the gift because they felt like they were not prepared with handling the logistics of accepting it. So that's obviously a huge financial opportunity. So the DAF can essentially be the recipient nonprofit for this kind of gift. They're responsible for selling it. And then the donor at that point can request that a distribution be made to the institution of their choice. And all that you in the museum community need to do is basically be able to educate your donors about this strategy and then bring the right parties together. So you might be wondering what the catch is here for the donor. And perhaps you've heard that gifts of tangible property to charity that are not so-called related use are less advantageous from a tax perspective for the donor, which is true. And perhaps that's maybe even been a non-starter for why you haven't pursued these conversations in the past. So what I'm going to try to do on the next slide is very ambitious and walk you through relatively quickly through some math and taxes, because I think it's really important to understand this piece just to see how compelling this could actually be for your donors in spite of this fact. So as an example, we're going to use a donor with a painting they bought for $250,000 that's now appreciated to $1 million. For example, a 90s Stanley Whitney painting. This donor's art collection is so large that they've actually had this wonderful painting in storage for the last 5 years. And you've approached them to make a gift to your museum, and they realize they have an asset like this painting, and they're thinking through, well, how can I potentially use this asset to advance my charitable goals? So let's consider scenario A, which is they sell the art first and then donate the proceeds to your museum. They sell the painting for $1 million. They pay $50,000 of sale expenses. That's an assumption, about 5%. And as a result, they have a capital gain of $750,000. The capital gain tax that they have to pay on that sale, capital gains are taxed at a rate of about 31.8%. So they're paying over $238,000 in tax on that gain. As a result, the net proceeds they have to give to your museum is the $1 million minus the $50,000 of sales costs minus the $238,000 of tax they paid, so $711,500. which is not too shabby. It's a nice amount of money to give to charity. And that donor can deduct on an income tax basis the full value of their gift, $711,500, for an estimated tax savings on a cash basis of north of $24,000. This is pretty good. However, you have to account for the fact that have to pay capital gains tax on that gain. So even though they get to take a large deduction, they actually only on a cash basis are saving a kind of modest $24,000 because their capital gain tax is so high. So looking at scenario 2, which is running this same artwork through a DAF first, once the artwork is contributed to the DAF sells it for the same $1 million. It pays the same 5% sale expenses. But now, since there's no capital gain tax assessed, the DAF itself can receive $950,000 proceeds from that gift. The donor then takes an income tax deduction of the cost basis, so the $250,000 they paid, multiplied by the donor's income tax rate, that becomes about a cash savings of approximately $92,000. When compared to scenario 1 on the left, you can see this donor's actually saving almost $68,000 on taxes, and they've been able to direct an incremental $238,000 to charity. So this is really significant in this specific example. And of course, the disclaimer being this is going to vary for every object in the donor-specific tax situation, but it is very interesting to run through the math on it. So we could go to the next slide. So just step by step to outline, how do you tee this up? What needs to happen? So first of all, you need to identify a donor that has an appreciated passion asset that they're willing to part with to support your organization. And actually, I had a friend who's on this phone call who once called it a dispassionate asset because it's an asset they perhaps no longer care to live with. And what you need to do is educate them and make them aware that this strategy exists, and then put the right parties together. So the donor needs to set up a DAF account with a DAF that's capable of accepting complex assets. Ours at Morgan Stanley is one of these DAFs. There are several others. And they make a gift of that artwork or whatever the object is to the DAF. And at that point, they take an income tax deduction. So then typically what our DAF does is it works in partnership with an art advisory firm to then sell the asset. And the goal through that sale is really maximizing value for the DAF. So they're going to consider what the right sales channel is for that object, whether it's auction or private sale. Do they sell it in London? Do they sell it in Hong Kong? Wherever the object will sort of do best. Once the artwork is sold and the sales proceeds are received by the DAF, the donor can then make distributions to their chosen charities. And at this point, you might be wondering, well, what's stopping a donor from selling a painting and then giving the money to an environmental nonprofit that talked to them, the week after I proposed this strategy to them? So there's ways to resolve this contractually. There's non-binding agreements that can be entered between the donor and the charity and the DAF. There's potentially binding agreements that would require a little bit more bells and whistles, but there are essentially ways that you as the charity can have some control over what happens once the DAF is funded in relationship with your donors. So you can go to the next slide. So on this page, I actually highlighted some real life examples that Morgan Stanley's DAF and the Fine Art Group, which is the art advisory firm that our DAF partners with to deaccession gifts, have worked with. And you can see that there's really a wide range of assets from art collections and coin collections and guitar collections that are funding a very wide range of philanthropic causes. I actually think the third example is maybe one of my favorites. This was a client that had a large guitar collection. And after he fell ill and really started focusing on his estate planning, he thought about setting up a museum for his guitars and was ultimately talked out of that idea, because as we all know, operating a standalone institution is very complicated. So he in turn basically transferred those guitars to the DAF. The DAF sold the guitars and he set up a fund that's now supporting youth and music. So I think that's a very nice example. So basically to conclude, I know that was a lot and it was fast and it was math, but I'm happy to answer any questions in Q&A. I know a couple came in while I was chatting and in any follow-up.
Yeah, let's thank you, Anna. Great. I do think it's really important to recognize that people, what Anna's undercutting is this assumption that restriction on the charitable contribution would impair even the usefulness of a tool like this. And so the math is really important because it actually shows that the net results can actually be equal or better under a DAF. So we'll get to that, and there are some questions. There may even be questions about how to use DAFs. You know, obviously a lot of nonprofits are trying to get donors to unleash assets in their DAFs as well. We'll just move forward right now with David Sand and his presentation on impact investing.
Thanks, Stephen. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And Stephanie and Anna are very, very hard acts to follow. So I'm going to talk a little bit, and then we'll move to the Q&A. The two of them spoke previously about ways to add additional capital, what direct or indirect fundraising. I want to talk a little bit about how the investment of that capital, particularly if it's in an endowment or a donor-advised fund or similar investment vehicle, how that can be done in a way that's mission and values aligned for museums and other cultural institutions. So we go to the next slide. I work for Community Capital Management. We're a 25-year-old impact investment firm. We work primarily in high credit quality fixed income. So we're a specialty bond manager. And all of the assets that we manage are both market rate financial returns, but also have some component or other of a positive societal and economic outcome. Firm is based in Florida. I work in our Boston office. We've been doing this work for a very long time, and we have a very diversified client base, which is what I want to start this presentation with. We work for financial institutions, healthcare, faith-based, lots of family offices. We also work for what I'm going to call today cultural institutions, which are folks like the guests here on this webinar, museums, foundations, community investments. We sort of group them together by thinking of them as anchor institutions, anchor cultural institutions. They all have, or you all have, some component of being place-based. Now, some museums obviously operate in multiple markets. I think that's kind of the exception. Most of you are very much tied to your local community, to the economic, social, and cultural ups and downs of that community. So we go to the next slide. One of the things that we've done fairly recently, in part for preparation for this event, is our two main forms of managing money are a fund we call the Community Impact Bond Fund, and then separate accounts. And so we have roughly 350 or so individual shareholders in our fund, and roughly 90 or so separately managed accounts. And interestingly, the percentage of those clients, the percentage of those investors, very roughly, is a third for each. So plus or minus 100 cultural and anchor institutions are investors in our fund, and plus or minus 30 out of 90 are cultural institutions that have separate accounts. And one of the things that we do as part of pursuing our strategy of being an impact manager with a values-aligned or mission-aligned investment is we have 14 impact themes that we pursue. One of them, which I want to spotlight here, is arts, culture, and support for the creative economy. Over the years in developing these themes, we found that there's client interest in supporting arts and culture and related activities. We do see in our pursuit of fixed income opportunities investments, I'll talk about some in just a minute, that fit with that theme. But what's very interesting for us as we look at our universe of cultural institution clients, they select for themselves, and we encourage clients to target geography, or we encourage them to target one or more of the impact themes, sometimes both. But the ones that have been favored the most by our cultural institution and foundation clients, you see in the lower left there, are sustainable communities, affordable housing, minority advancement, education and childcare, and gender lens. So in terms of who in our society right now, who in our culture right now is broad-minded, versus who is narrow-minded. I'm not going to get into who I think is narrow-minded at this moment in time, but clearly the cultural institutions that become our clients are looking at support for their community in ways in addition to the support directly for institutions like themselves that are, museums or similar cultural institutions. We do have clients who've asked us to focus and emphasize the arts and culture theme. We have about a dozen or so of those. We've invested over $200 million specifically for that theme, specifically in investments where we as managers know that those investments are consistent and compatible with our risk and return and financial objectives, but also have a use of proceeds that we know supports cultural institution. If we flip ahead to the next slide, just a little more summary data. So this is just the same data showing where the cultural institutions and foundations have chosen what they've chosen from their impact themes. And you can see arts and culture is down about 3/4 of the way down. But again, the top ones are more, I would say, broadly mission aligned, broadly values aligned. And basically, as I know a little bit about the Remuseum, raison d'etre. They're basically thinking about the institution, the museum, or what have you, beyond its four walls, beyond its immediate activity for members and for arts and for adding to larger membership and larger arts. They're thinking about their role within the larger community as a citizen, as a permanent actor, as a place-based investor. Go to the next slide, just showing again how do they break down roughly 40% targeted geography. So the museum, and there's such great geographic representation in those of you that are on the call today. A lot of investors come to us. I really don't even want to pick a geography because I don't want to leave anybody out, but they're in XYZ city, and so they say that they want to be supportive of serving the underserved, economic activity, economic development activity within their geography. Then 30% more or less will target an impact theme, like I talked about. And then for the larger clients, for those that are investing in a separately managed account, roughly 30% do both. So they'll typically choose their home market, whether it's the city or the county that they're in or the state that they're in. That's completely up to the client. And then themes that resonate with them from a citizenship perspective. If we go to the next slide, just want to give an example, two examples actually. So this one is Manhattan Plaza. I know a lot of you on the call are from New York. This is a 1970s era affordable housing rental property, specifically targeted to people in the arts, the performing arts in particular. I like this one a lot because I grew up on the west side of Manhattan. This one's not that far away. It's been around for a long time. There have been some very interesting artists that have actually been tenants there over the years. Some of you may have seen the Alicia Keys musical Hell's Kitchen. That is directly based on her experience growing up in Manhattan Plaza. Was on Broadway for a while. And then not quite as highbrow, but Larry David lived there for a period of time and had a next door neighbor whose last name was Kramer. So definitely made a contribution to the broader culture as well. I mentioned that this is a 1970s era property, and I think that's significant for thinking about place-based investing from the standpoint of some of the folks that are on the call. This neighborhood, when I was growing up, was nothing like what it is now in terms of how much it has been gentrified, how expensive it is to live there, whether it's to own a home or rent a home. But because this was built in the 70s when it had not been gentrified, this is a permanent part of the West Side community, the greater Lincoln Center community, if you want to think of it that way, and it's permanently affordable. So in markets around the country that are experiencing growth, experiencing urban development, gentrification, taking steps now when it's possible to support permanent, affordable rental housing for people in the arts. And it's very broadly defined. It's obviously it's artists, but it's also people that work for arts museums, people who work, broadly defined in the performing arts and visual arts space, is something that can have a benefit for one or two or more generations after that. Next slide, last one I want to talk about is in Miami. City of Miami recently did an arts deal, a bond that was specifically designed to support the cultural infrastructure. I'm sure many of you know Miami's a bit of a art boom town right now. They wanted to take advantage of that, and one of the institutions that's supported by that bond deal is the Bass Museum. That picture, if you can see it, looks like an artist or a museum director. It's actually my colleague Jamie from a site visit we did there. And I neglected to do this for the Manhattan Plaza, but if you look in the upper left corner, lots of the transactions that we support are affiliated or tagged to multiple impact themes. So this one, obviously, it's supporting a group of cultural institutions, so it fits for arts and culture. Not so much this deal, but another deal that was in this bond issuance was for affordable housing. And then also there was a contribution for education, childcare, sustainable communities, and enterprise development. So that's the formal presentation of what I had. We work with lots of folks in varying aspects of how they want to look at these issues. One of the things, just going back to fundraising, most of us came of age at a time when the actual investment management of endowments or similar pools of money was not related to mission. We've seen in the last quarter century or so a big change in there, where donors and institutions themselves are both asking questions for how the investments that keep the institution going, hopefully in perpetuity, how are those investments mission aligned and values aligned? There's been a lot of movement in the field. There are a lot more choices and tools available to folks like you and your institutions than there used to be. And hopefully with continued growth in the space, you'll have even more choices and options in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Now we will open up to Q&A. I just should say, to go back to and bring in all four of us here. To David's point, it's not just museums choosing to become real estate developers, it's museums deciding that some aspect of real estate development is aligned with their mission. And, I know that I can name a few, and I know I won't name them all. David and I know some of them together, but the Clifford Still Museum in Denver, the Cam Houston, I know the Walters in Baltimore did some work in this area. So, there is a number of reasons why museums would consider this. Sometimes they own real estate and they're trying to figure out how to develop it in a mission-line way that supports museum operations as well. Other museums are in areas that have become so high-priced, it's hard for their staff to find housing nearby, and they can also promote the creative economy in that way. So, once you start thinking more broadly about the mission, as David said, beyond the walls, these sources of capital can become, increasingly interesting. But there's a number of DAF-related questions, Anna, not surprisingly. You've probably seen them. One specifically was about Laura McDonald, who joined and led a really popular webinar Remuseum hosted last year on major donor fundraising. Is familiar with this sector and noted that universities and other large nonprofits have set up their own DAFs. Are you aware of any cultural institutions or museums that have done that? And maybe what kind of scale and infrastructure does it take to set up a the capacity to support DAFs?
So it's interesting. Actually, Morgan Stanley used to have a white label DAF product that they would let a cultural institution set up, like, you know, XYZ Museum DAF. But just to be clear, just because you have a DAF in the name of your institution doesn't mean that you are the recipient of all the gifts being made through that DAF. It basically is like an envelope, and you get more insight into where your donors are giving, and you can be, you know, sending out messages to potentially point them in the direction of supporting your institution, but you don't control the funds ultimately. So yes, I think it is entirely possible, and I think there's infrastructure to do it that actually would make it not so hard to get it off the ground. There was a couple.
Your point is you're still acting like a community foundation itself, or Fidelity or Morgan Stanley, and so you're just supporting their philanthropy. Presumably, if it's housed at a nonprofit that they can make grants to, then they'll be more likely to, but not necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, I think this model has existed in like religious communities for a long time.
Yeah.
Like there's like a lot of Jewish DAFs, for example, and those donors are supporting a lot of causes, many of which might be related to that community, but some of which are totally related to other interests those families have.
And let me just quickly move on for the sake of time. Laura also asked about scenario 3, the guitar collector, about, you know, I think there's still going to be, it's interesting, as this evidence, there's still questions about how can we maintain the maximum deduction there? Is there any model where that can be maintained? And I'll address the fact that, you know, museums have not solicited these gifts, certainly in the case of gifts of art. When I was a museum director, we had some of these gifts made to us, which was interesting. Collectors of very large collections sometimes gave us gifts with the with the proviso that we could sell any of them that we wanted after 3 years, because 3 years is the amount of time to preserve their maximum tax deduction. So that's, for art, that's a scenario museums could, I think, be a little more creative about, because I'm not sure how many, you know, I believe there are collectors out there who are not necessarily trying to impose a perpetual burden on the museum in terms of preserving both the financial and environmental burden of preserving their work in perfect condition forever, especially if it's not likely to be shown.
I agree. And yes, I think obviously for the donor, best case scenario is this related use gift, and it has to be going to an institution where the gift is related to the mission and they're willing to hold it for 3 years. So if the institution can make those accommodations, it's kind of a win-win scenario for everyone. Caveat being the museum needs to figure out how they're going to sell that object. But again, there's no reason I can think of that keeps the museum from going to the fine art group and asking them to sell it the same way they would be selling it out of the DAF. So it's just is thinking about what process should exist. But the DAF, and this relates to a question that came in through the chat from Mark, basically any gift to the DAF is not going to be a related use gift, because the mission of the DAF is not to show artwork or, you know, whatever else that you're giving to it. So the DAF is, I guess, like, it's an interesting conduit, and it is an interesting way of encouraging your donors to think about setting up these multi-generational giving vehicles, which might end up benefiting your institution significantly in the long run. But there's tax nuances around for the donors.
Stephanie, you were going to make a point, not regarding that question, I guess, or am I reading that correctly?
Anna, there's a follow-up. Do you just want to briefly go on that?
Yeah, let's just go ahead and jump to that question. Yeah. So I may be saying your answer, not the question. So go ahead.
The second question, Laura, I think that's entirely up to the institution and the donor and how they agree this gift will be processed. So, sorry, the question was, will the proceeds be limited to a restricted or acquisition fund / endowment? I would guess that would be very institution specific.
I can just quickly chime in on the question that Richard O'Leary made in the Q&A about, you know, what we're all talking about are really based on traditional models for museums and looking for funding for each other. And I think one piece, thinking about climate and resilience and, you know, in the environment, is that a lot of these are needs like deferred maintenance even, and they will save money, right, for organizations, and they're looking at their operations to be more efficient and sustainable. You know, installing, you know, building automation systems decreases the use, you know, the need for staff to, you know, be manually making changes and lets them, you know, open up time for other things most of the time. So it's really about making a better choice. There's really isn't just a best choice, and I think, I agree on I'll let Stephen chime in on the earned income, comment, but I do think a lot of this work isn't just to do it, but it's because there are a lot of cost savings that are, there's data behind to do this work.
Yeah. Certainly, it's a great suggestion that we consider a webinar on earned income models. I would note that in my view, the ones that work are not the very traditional ones. So I think what would be really interesting to look at the museums are finding mission-based kind of earned income opportunities that are uniquely, that arise from their skill sets, their talents. And I can think of it, I won't go into detail, but there are a few in mind, or their situation. I will say that I think one of the things museums need to consider in a constrained environment is whether their traditional earned income lines of business of retail, food service, facility rentals are actually generating any net income at all. And I think museums have been, frankly, a little slow to evaluate actually the indirect costs that go into those functions. And not to say there aren't reasons to offer something to eat and drink to visitors and something to buy and maybe even something to rent. But I think the question of right sizing those businesses at this time is more important than ever. So really, really good topics. There is not a lot of data around that. I think partly because museums have not gone through a full accounting for the indirect costs associated with those businesses. And I will address, we will be sharing the PowerPoint post presentation. So we'll address that question quickly. David, there's a question. I'll come back to a question about I'll address the question. There's a question about deaccessioning. And I'll just, so if the collector makes the gift on the terms that all they're really driven by is the tax deduction, the museum has a choice at that point of whether or not to accession the artwork or not. And I'll just give an example. When I was director of the Speed Museum, we had a very tax motivated collector who twice gave us very large single artist collections towards the end of the year. And so what we did is we didn't accession them. We committed, and it proceeded after I left, but we committed to the work of spending the time to study them to figure out which works we wanted to accession, which would be far less than all, and then know that we had the freedom to sell them after the others after 3 years because they hadn't been accessioned. Of course, if they had been accessioned, the proceeds could in fact only be used for either purchase of additional art or direct care of the collection under the policies. David, there's a question about the interrelationship of impact investing in state and local tax credits. Do you want to talk about that for a second?
Yes, I saw the question about tax credits, but also about tax bonding, and it is very, very regionally specific. Each state, well, I shouldn't say each, most states have some form of entity, an economic development authority. I mean, they all have different names on a state-by-state basis that can come to market either for tax exempt or taxable issuance in support of projects like a museum, like an expansion of a museum, like something that is bricks and mortar, but they can fund the state agency or for larger municipalities, city and regional agencies can raise money for it a much more capital efficient way. There is no national, at least that we're familiar with, mechanism to do that, but there are in just about every state and most major cities as well, but they're all a little bit different, unfortunately.
Great. Well, we are at an hour. I do just want to, Stephanie, I know while there's uncertainty about the IRA, but just do remind us the scale of that legislation was what, almost $1 trillion of investing. So I think the interest, I want to say, even in a time of uncertainty, the importance of examining whether any aspect of that bill can benefit cultural institutions still remains really fresh.
Absolutely. I mean, and I think if, we're seeing a lot more focus on some of like the larger entity like manufacturing or even utility level, sizing, pieces of it. And so that would be great, right? Let's leave the homeowners, organization size entities out of it, who are really benefiting it and increasing even labor, right? Labor opportunity in different states. So we'll be, definitely tracking that, use those resources to keep up with it as well.
Well, thanks so much to the three of you. Thank you to the several hundred people who shared their lunchtime or an hour of their morning with us. Again, we hope that the information we provided here and by follow-up will be useful to helping you fulfill your mission more sustainably at a critical time for museums. Thank you all.